Hello, folks. This is from a project that I'm not working on now, but from one that I worked on over the past few years. Just to start with a brief sort of meta note, I'm a national lab scientist. The needs of a nation of people and science both evolve over time. So the projects that I've worked on over my, I think, 6 years at the, no, 5 years at the National Laboratory now, um, have evolved concurrently. I started working on the exascale computing project. We now have exascale computers and applications that can run on them. I started on the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, and while energy storage is certainly not solved already, the challenges which convened that program, like the exascale computing project, have been partially addressed, and we've, as a kind of laboratory, a nation, as science, have evolved and targeted something else. So now I don't work on this particular type of effort that I'm about to describe anymore, but I still know a lot about it. So this is a video that I'm recording to make sure that my now what I knew was recorded before my memory fades, because I'm working on other things that are equally as exciting. This particular project here was from a seed project at Argonne that wasn't certainly not fully grown, but is not something I'm working on now either because we're waiting for the conditions, i.e. funding, to arrive that will give us time to grow that program further. That whole project was focused on creating computational ways to identify good molecules for transporting hydrogen between, say, long distances. You could say add hydrogen into the molecule, which requires a lot of energy and the availability of hydrogen, and then ship it somewhere that they can easily pluck the hydrogen off and use it to power a fuel cell or something. Very cool technology. And our little slice of the pie on trying to make that happen in this particular example is answering the question, can we find other molecules that could serve this purpose perhaps better by looking for molecules that have descriptions in science papers which sound a lot like the ones that were used to describe materials that are already known to do this well. So through that process, we ended up coming up with a list of every molecule. We found every name that it's known by. We mapped it to sentences which contain that name found in scientific papers. And that was a lot of sort of software, frankly, that, or just put simply, that has to come together to be able to create a plot like the one I'm showing here, where I have different subsets of molecules ordered by how much hydrogen you could store on them and how much energy it takes to retrieve that hydrogen off of it. And all this is done backed by a database that, say, I can run a query like this, like find the molecules that were from the subset that I chose randomly of those which had the right conditions to store hydrogen, and get me only there, or the ones that I've computed storage energy was, and get just the properties and the names. Don't bother retrieving anything else about the record to save me some memory. Because I put all of this in a database, searching through 100 million molecules took 3 minutes, which is pretty good. You can make that a lot faster with databases. That'll be a whole nother talk, so we're not going to get into that today. So with that big preamble aside, let's talk about how we built the foundations of this project, namely how to create a database and how we populated it with the data describing what molecules are out there and what they're called. So the first step in all this is starting a database. I happen to like MongoDB, working with document stores, things that express each record not as a table, but as a series of name key values, like name, list of names, property, property name, value. I like that kind of database. It just makes sense to me more. So that's what I opted with, though this is not the only way, certainly, to do things. Additionally, I like MongoDB because it's one that I speak I know how to program it well, so it's relatively easy for me to get started with. Now, in terms of getting started with, One of the first things one can do to start up MongoDB is not necessarily to install it as a service running on your computer, that you start with something like sudo system control, and then like MongoDB start. You don't have to do it that way. You can make it run as a process that doesn't require administrator permissions. The word sudo here signifying that I need to be a admin on the computer to make it work. You can install it with CondaForge and be able to run it as a simple process. Now, that looks something like this. Oops. First step, make a directory where your data is going to be stored. Make one of these configuration files that says where to store it, as well as some other kind of useful information. Mongo will by default store all of your database in memory, or as much of it in memory as it can. I don't want that because I'm doing other things on my computer right now. So I'm capping it, and I'm like creating some logs and a default port. And once I've got all that, I can take MongoDB and I can launch it using this command. No sudo, starts up right away. It has now created my database and we're good to go. Second step, downloading the molecules. I like PubChem for many reasons. It's well organized and it's easy to work with if you're a data scientist. And we'll show you this in a moment. Here I'm connecting to the database. I created a name, and that's the port number from my config file. You can see I've connected to it, and I've gone through and found that it has no data in it already, which is, you saw me just create a empty directory and populate it. Quick thing about Mongo before I get back to praising PubChem. Here, the way that Mongo databases are set up is you have a hierarchy. I've got my Mongo server. My server contains databases that each contain collections of documents, documents being individual records that all kind of look the same. So I've got my carbon-free database. The name of the project was something around the tune of carbon-free energy storage and transport. So I've got my carbon-free database. I've got molecule records collection. And right now we can see that it's empty. Now, back to saying why I like PubChem. PubChem has an FTP server where they have their data stored in text files. Instead of having to go through PubChem's website and crawl it, I can just download it. And you can see here that they keep them up to date. Yeah, the last one was created, looks like about 12 hours ago. So they keep it up to date. It's awesome. Real hat tip to PubChem for being a great example of data and science. Now, of all the data that they want, I need two things. I need a list of all of their molecules by structure. And I need for each of those molecules what the names are that it's called. So I've got two different files I'm pulling down. We're going to start the download process while I talk because they're multiple gigabytes. Now, first one is the SMILES string. SMILES string is a way of writing out the molecule structure as text. And the CID SMILES file is a map of compound ID, the record identifier of a molecule within PubChem, to that SMILES ID, 1-to-1. For every record, there's exactly one SMILES string. The other kind that I'm looking up is a synonyms. For each compound, it has many synonyms. There are many names something can go by. So I've written two functions to go through and collect that information. So first thing, get SMILES string. The way that this one works, and it's finished downloading already, so we can demo it. What I do is I create a temporary directory where I'm going to put the file. I give a file name. I use the requests library to open a stream to the data that I pull. So a stream means I'm going to read from it periodically. I'm not going to read the entire thing at once. And then I'm going to open up a path to the file that I write it to. Then these are two different files. Python's script utils, there it is, shutils, has a function that reads from one file and writes to another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the request, I'm going to read the raw bytes, and I'm going to write it to that output file. You'll note here that I opened that file in binary mode. because I'm never even bothering to convert this to text, much less decompress it. Once I've got it open, I open the file, and this is a generator function. So what it does is it steps through the file only when I ask it to. And each time I ask, it reads another line, and it returns the contents of the line. First word in the line, the compound number, an integer. Second thing in the line, the name. So if you see here, I call the function, and I'm using the more iter tools library to give me ability to peek at the generator. So here I'm looking at what is at the front of the kind of stream of molecule IDs and smile strings that are going to come out. But I'm not actually advancing forward. So I can go up peek again and get the same result. It won't advance through that generator of data. And by the way, I've got a video on generators that will explain them, and I'll post a link to that. Here's the other one. This one's a little more complicated. Same thing. I'm creating another temporary file, and I'm copying it. But here I have a series of lines that all describe the same molecule. So what I do is I get the name of the molecule in the line, and if it's the same one that I've read before, or I just add it to the list of names for that molecule. So if I go through and first line is 1, I've started a list. The second one is also dealing with entry number 1. I append that, so now I've got 2 names in the array names. And this continues until I get to number 2. At number 2, this has reached its condition where it's true. I am going to return the list of names that I've found for that identifier. And I'm going to reset my counter. So I've now returned the names that belong to 1. I update my counter to 2. I clear my list, and then I continue. And actually, as I'm reading this, it looks like I've got oh, nope, I don't have a bug here. So I continue, and then I add the name in. So this, I'll just show you the result. That'll make it a little bit more clear. So if we look out, the first one iterated CID and smiles. Oh, it's not called smiles. Oh, looks like I never returned it. But you can see here that the first thing off the list is the number 1 and the smile string, which tells me the molecular structure. The first thing off this one is number 1, and then a series of names. This molecule here happens to be called acetylcarnitine, and a whole bunch of other things. All these mean the same record. All right, so I've now got 2 things that I can do. I can take the data coming off of PubChem, and I can compile them into a mapping of molecule ID to molecule structure and molecule ID to molecule names. So now I've got 2 bits of information that I want to store about the same record. The next step is, how do I combine them into a sensible document? So as we recall earlier, a document is a collection of data that's somewhat in a key value pair setup. I've got ID number 1, structure, that smile string I showed you, names, a list of names. So I'm going to combine those values into the same document. Now, I've got a function here that does it, but instead of explaining the function, we're going to go to the tool that I use to create this object called molecule record. So a molecule record is built using a tool called mongo-engine. What mongo-engine does is provides me the ability to describe what a document will look like using Python, and then once I've described what that structure is, provide me a series of tools to say add functions to that document. Like, let's say, looks like I don't have any functions on it here, but perhaps I wanted to take for any document and count how many names are in there. Like, I could add property def num names self int and return self dot names. So I've now added a function to this document and made it more useful than just a storage of records. You can see here also I've created class methods so I can make this document using a quick route instead of having to compute elsewhere the smiles and the entry form of that molecule structure. I've got a function that just does it at the same time. Nice and handy. And you can see here that some other things I define, like I say that my identifier, all the ways I can describe my molecule, I've got a key. It's called an entry key. It's a hash of a molecule structure that's of a fixed length. So it's very quick to be able to check it or find a record in a database based on a key rather than a string of indeterminate lists or indeterminate length. I then have a dictionary of identifiers, which are, say, the different ways of describing the molecule structure. I've got names, I've got properties, I've got subsets, I've got everything that I know that my record of a molecule is going to eventually look like and contain. You don't have to do it this way with MongoDB, but I'm comforted whenever I can create some tools to verify that all of my data is in the same structure. Even though MongoDB is flexible enough that I could have documents where I describe each different molecule in a slightly different way, that's going to be a headache for me to write software to handle different types of databases, or sorry, different types of records within the same database. So I find it really handy to just write down that specification ahead of time. And that's something that I can then use when reading the molecules. So here I take a molecule record, say an integer and a string, that comes out of my mapping file that I created earlier, and I use them to assemble a molecule record. So I take the CID and the strings, and I create the molecule record. If something goes wrong, I just return none to signify that things aren't broken. And then I attach an identifier, say the PubChem ID, and return that record. So now I've got a function that can run and create my new records. So let's see how that's done here. So now that I've got this function, I've got my smiles iterator, which produces these integers and structures. Recall one of those functions I showed you earlier that downloaded and created a generator is ready to generate a bunch of these strings. And the way this loop is going to work is it's going to create a lot of these records. Once it creates a record, I check if I have any names for it by looking to see, well, is the next available record on the list the one that I'm looking for? If so, or if not, I advance until I find it. One thing I didn't mention, PubChem and their gracious kind of creation have their file ordered such that it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, which is brilliant. Both files are running in progressive order, so I can use that when writing code here. I can loop through, I can iterate through one and loop through the other, like continually advancing, knowing exactly where I'm going to find those names. So here I've got some loops that finds the names for the molecule, and that's going to run. Now I'm going to trip this to run because it's going to take a little bit, and explain a few other things. All right, so first of all, well, one, you can see it processes a couple thousand iterations a second. Part of that is because I'm running the record creation in parallel. I'm using parallel processing's IMAP, which is going to pass chunks of 1,000 smile strings to a separate processor. But even if they're completed out of order, it's going to return them all in the same order. So I know that step one is always going to be, or the first record is going to be record number 1, the second one's going to be record number 2, and so on. The other thing about this loop is even though I'm going through record by record, I've written some logic here to only store, or only call the store operation on chunks of what I think are about 10,000. I'd have to go check the top of the file to find where I defined right chunk size. Now I want to do that because calling a database for a single record is expensive. It's a lot faster for the database if you can give it a lot of records to work with at once. So if I want to say find a bunch of things, it can run little optimizations that if it knows it's trying to find a bunch of different records, it can say find nearby ones together. Like imagine if, let's say using this insert many operation as an example, I'm trying to insert books at a library. Now if I had a big stack of books on the collection table, I'd want to say grab all the nonfiction and then walk to the nonfiction section. It's at a time at once, rather than going back for each nonfiction book. That could save me a lot of walking. There's similar things that can happen inside of the database, and I'm allowing that to happen by using this insert many. It costs me a lot of extra code here, but it's worthwhile in terms of operations, because at the end of the day, I'm storing 100,000 molecules, and that's going to take a while. On top of this, I did run and use this script running on a compute cluster. And compute clusters have notoriously slow file systems for very small operations like reading or writing only a single record to a database. So I really needed to take advantage of the database's ability to make a lot of double counting of work occur when I'm storing many records at once. So that's the sort of last set of tricks on how I process everything. Just to recap, I wrote a function to be able to take the record off the top of an iterator. I wrote it as a function so that I can run it in parallel using multiprocessing's IMAP. And even though that I'm kind of formalizing and finalizing the records that I need to create within a loop that goes one by one, I only store every, say, 10,000 iterations such that I can take advantage of the database's ability to operate on a batch faster than it could operate on the same number of records but individually. And that's how I created the database. Now, if I run the full thing, going back to my GitHub, it looks like it took 2 hours to process the whole thing. So PubChem has, what's that? 36 million molecules in it. Wonderful. And even processing at 5,000 a second, that's still 2.5 hours. So I'm not going to show you that whole demo today. But what I will say is once you have that database, you can start doing some complicated things like find all of the documents that belong to a certain set of materials and mark them like that. So here I've gotten the entry keys. Remember, entry keys are a nice, easy, unique key for a molecule. And I'm finding all of the database, or all of the records in the database that belong to a certain list, and I'm labeling them as subset known. So you can see here that operating on it took 4 milliseconds to be able to find those 124 molecules out of millions and label them. Databases are great. And I can count them, that took 1 millisecond. So we can do a lot of complicated algorithms. I've already talked through all of this data for about 30 minutes, or all of this. One, how did I create the database? In the first place, took me about 25 minutes. I'll probably record another video where I explain how to run some query operations on it using MongoDB, but hopefully that gives you at least a quick walkthrough. So to recap, what I wanted to do was create a database that would allow me to make plots like where are all of the known molecules in terms of their gas storage capacity and energy penalty, so I can compare different ways of finding new ones. I created a database by reading from PubChem. Thanks to PubChem's lovely FTP server, I used generators to be able to read through those files incrementally rather than reading through them individually. And I stored them in a database using a database structure that I defined using mongo-engine, such that I could double check and be very sure that all of the molecules in that database had the same structure, facilitating all of that analysis down the pipeline. That's at least one kind of view into a project that I worked on and learned a lot from. That looks like I did all of this work over a year ago. So I'm hopeful that I can record a few other things about it before my memory fades further. Thank you, and I'm hopeful that you're having a good day too. Take care.